Hello, everyone. I hope you can take a few relaxing and enjoyable moments away from the busyness of life. Thank you for visiting the channel. I hope you enjoy this story and share your thoughts with me. What do you think of this voice? Please let me know in the comments. Shall we begin the story? At the Grand Deliberation Chamber on Halcyon Ring, Commander Elara Veyne stood beneath the judicial seals and waited for the session to begin. She was Earth's emergency legal envoy, sent to answer for the deaths at Corridor 9. If she failed, the Galaxy Council would mark Earth as a reckless power before the whole known network. Every government watching the hearing would remember the judgment. Halcyon Ring was not a world. It was a diplomatic station built where 5 trade routes crossed, far from any sovereign sun, so every empire could pretend it trusted neutral ground. The chamber at its center was older than most living treaties. Pale stone-covered alloy ribs and a slow map of shipping lanes moved across the ceiling. Every balcony was full. Every lens in the room was pointed at the human woman on the floor below. Elara kept her hands still behind her back. That mattered because many of the species seated above her had spent the last 9 days repeating the same sentence in different languages. Earth had fired first. To the public, the accusation was simple. A civilian convoy entered Corridor 9 under refugee markings. A mixed protection fleet moved to intercept, and Earth's escort squadron arrived from the east approach. Then the convoy broke apart under concentrated fire. Diversion spread across the major channels showed alarms, shattered hulls, confused traffic, and a burst pattern blamed on Earth-made batteries. The dead came from 6 species and 3 protectorates. That was enough to turn outrage into consensus. But the truth beneath the footage was not simple at all. That was why Elara did not trust anyone in that chamber who called the case obvious. A voice came from her right. "They're filling the upper civilian galleries now," Jonas Vale said quietly. "The translation feeds have gone live." Jonas was Earth mission legal, younger than he wanted to look and sharp enough to be resented by older officers. He held a slate close to his side and watched the far tiers. "They want the emotion in the room before the evidence appears," he said. Elara gave a small nod. "That means they've already decided what they want the evidence to mean." Jonas hesitated. "We still have time to change course." He did not need to say more. They had been arguing the same point for 31 hours. Earth had a sealed archive package that could tear apart the narrow accusation against its fleet. It could show altered sensor paths, false transponder echoes, and timing gaps between the public record and the raw tactical logs. Used well, it could keep Earth from being condemned in a single afternoon. But Elara had still refused to release it. Jonas lowered his voice. "If we put the archive in on opening submission, we survive the day. If we put it in now," Elara said, "we survive the day and lose the case that matters." He looked at her, tired and angry. "The case that matters is the one with our world's name on it." "No," she said. "That is the case they want us to think matters." The chamber doors opened fully. Delegates and observers rose in layers as the judicial procession crossed the floor. At the center walked Arbiter Sarek Val, tall and silver-skinned, his robe cut in precise geometric folds that made him look like a machine wearing ceremony. He carried himself like a man who believed institutions failed only when weak people stopped believing in them. To his left walked Minister Thelon Kreth of the Border Stability Coalition, broad-shouldered and scaled at the throat, with the calm expression of someone who had spent years making harsh policy sound like arithmetic. He would lead the accusation. To Sarek's right moved 2 associate judicial officers and the chamber record keeper. The room settled. The station's translation lattice hummed alive, then softened into near silence. Sarek Val spoke first. "This public deliberative session of the Council Judicial Forum is now in order. We convene to examine the actions of Earth military and legal authority in relation to the mass casualty event at Corridor 9, with special concern for unlawful force, unauthorized corridor breach, and destabilization of protected border procedure." His voice carried easily across the stone and metal. "What is decided here will be understood across all transit systems." That line was for the audience. He was framing Earth not as one actor under inquiry, but as a danger to every fragile border in the network. Sarek turned. Commander Elara Veyne of Earth, you stand as declared envoy, authorized to answer for policy, command interpretation, and emergency legal doctrine. Do you affirm your representation? I do, Elara said. Her voice was level, not loud, not defensive. For a moment, she let the room look at her exactly as it wanted to. Human, outnumbered, one figure on the floor beneath a ring of older governments. Then Sarek inclined his head to Velon Kreth. You may proceed. Velon did not rush. Men like him never did when the room already leaned their way. Honored arbiter, assembled delegates, and citizens observing across the transit lattice. He began, we gather under grief. 6 peoples buried their dead this week because a volatile situation at a disputed border was made worse by one world's refusal to accept lawful containment. He moved through the accusation with practiced control. The convoy, he said, had entered a regulated distress lane under temporary freeze conditions. Coalition monitors had established containment to prevent armed contamination of refugee traffic. Earth forces, arriving without council instruction, forced a corridor opening with military pressure. During the collapse that followed, escort batteries under Earth coordination fired into a traffic field already saturated with civilian signatures. The screens above the chamber shifted to path models and impact maps. Elara watched the public version unfold in clean arrows and clean timelines. Too clean, Velon continued. This is not the first time Earth has confused moral urgency with legal exemption. It is not the first time Earth has mistaken restraint by elder powers for permission to improvise. The chamber need not decide whether Earth intended massacre. It need only decide whether Earth's conduct made massacre possible. He let that line sit. It was a skillful move. Intention was harder to prove. System failure through arrogance was easier. It gave the room a way to condemn Earth without having to call humanity monstrous. Jonas shifted near the rear bench, and Elara knew what he was thinking. He wanted her to open the archive package now, break the clean arrows, and let the timing gap speak before the chamber's version hardened into fact. Elara kept her face unchanged. Velon called the first witness summaries into record. A convoy navigator from the Yedrin League. A medical tender pilot. A coalition censeur analyste. Each piece had been trimmed to the same story. The lane was unstable. Earth entered hot. Earth escalated. Civilian signatures died afterward. By the time he finished, the chamber felt denser. Not louder. Worse. It was the kind of silence that meant people were settling into judgment. Sarek turned toward Elara. Commander Veyne, your opening answer. Jonas looked up from the rear line and met her eyes. This was the last clean chance. Elara took one measured step toward the center speaker field. Earth recognizes the dead at Corridor 9. We recognize the loss across every affected convoy and every affected world. We do not dismiss grief, and we do not ask this chamber to lower the weight of what occurred. That was the answer the room expected from a cornered envoy. Then she continued, but Earth will not submit exculpatory evidence at opening stage. The chamber changed in a single breath. Not chaos, something sharper. A ripple of disbelief passed through the upper levels. Several translated feeds clipped and restarted at once. Jonas closed his eyes for one brief second. Velon Kreth did not move at all, but a thin line appeared along the edge of his jaw. Sarek Vol spoke first. You declined to answer the accusation with a defense record? I decline to submit Earth's defensive archive at this stage, Elara said. On what grounds? On the grounds that this chamber has not yet established what exactly it believes it is judging. A low murmur spread outward. Sarek's expression cooled. The charge is plain. No, Elara said. The story is plain. The charge is not. That was dangerous language in a room like this. It challenged not one minister, but the chamber's appetite for easy clarity. Velon lifted a hand. Commander Veyne, if Earth possesses records that could narrow liability and chooses not to disclose them, the reasonable inference is that those records do not withstand scrutiny. Elara turned toward him. That is one inference. It is the strongest. It is the most convenient. The civilian tears stirred again. Sarek intervened at once. This chamber is not a theater for rhetorical posturing. If Earth has material relevant to immediate responsibility, withholding it is a grave act. Elara met his gaze. Yes, she said. It is. That answer threw him off by a fraction. Most envoys would have hidden behind procedure. She had agreed with the severity. Sarek leaned forward slightly, then explained the act. Elara let the silence work before she answered. Because if Earth submits what it has now, this chamber will do what it has already prepared to do. It will reduce Corridor 9 to a narrow question of local force and local fault. It will protect the systems beneath that question, and then it will call that justice. The words landed harder than she raised them. Velon stepped in before Sarek could recover the room. What Commander Veyne calls structure, others call law. Refugee corridors do not maintain themselves. Border traffic does not regulate itself. Distress zones do not de-weaponize themselves. The chamber should note what Earth is doing. It is refusing evidence while implying some hidden architecture of blame. That is not restraint. That is manipulation. It would be manipulation, Elara said, if I were asking the chamber to trust my feeling. I am not. Then what are you asking? She looked around the chamber, up through layers of faces, species, and flags. I'm asking what this body is prepared to certify in public before it hears what Earth has withheld. That held the room because it did not sound like a normal defense. Sarek's tone sharpened. Commander, you will answer the accusation in sequence. I will, Elara said. But first I want the chamber to state, for the record, that it regards the current border framework governing Corridor 9 and adjacent humanitarian lanes as valid, intact, and built on reliable original data. Now the room did more than murmur. Jonas stared at her from across the floor. He knew that question. He knew what she was touching. But even he had not expected her to press it in the first exchange. Phelan's answer came fast. The governing framework is not on trial. It is if your accusation relies on it. The accusation relies on conduct. Conduct inside what? Elara asked. A lawful corridor? A lawful distress map? A lawful designation of hostile and civilian flow? Those are not decorations, Minister. They're the ground beneath every choice made that day. Sarek cut across both of them. This chamber will not be redirected before the preliminary record is complete. Then you may proceed with your preliminary record, Elara said. Earth will respond in full when the chamber is willing to say what system that record stands on. Velon turned slightly toward the delegates, a practiced move meant to gather the room. Behind him, you see the tactic. Delay. Fold. Enlargement. Earth does not want to answer for Corridor 9. It wants to drown the dead in procedure. Elara did not flinch. No, I want the dead counted on the right map. That sentence reached farther than the others. The chamber did not like it. That was useful. Rooms like this were easiest to defeat when they became offended by precision. Sarek brought the opening phase to a procedural close and ordered recess before witness examination. The tone of his order made clear that Earth's position had already cost goodwill before the real contest began. As the delegates rose into clusters, the public feeds stayed live, filling with commentary, outrage, and contempt. Several upper balconies emptied toward the discussion galleries. Every corridor outside the chamber now carried the same idea. The human envoy had come without the courage to defend her own world. Jonas joined Elara in a narrow consultation alcove behind Earth's assigned bench. That was either brilliant, he said tightly, or catastrophic. It was necessary. You just gave Kreth the exact image he wanted. Human envoy refuses evidence. Human envoy plays theory over bodies. The neutral bloc was looking for a reason to stop listening. They were looking for a reason to vote cleanly, Elara said. That is not the same thing. Jonas looked around to make sure the privacy field held. I need to hear you say it plainly. We do have enough to break their direct narrative, yes. Yes. Then why are we still not using it? Elara took the slate from his hand and brought up the sealed package without opening it. She knew nearly every line by memory already. Raw sensor latency. Weapon signature mismatch. Ghost transponder reflections from dead cargo shells. The evidence could save Earth from the narrow accusation. It could also let the chamber declare the matter resolved without touching the system beneath it. Because this does not end if we win an arrow question, she said. It hardens. Jonas pressed his lips together. You're asking Earth to absorb more damage now for a larger strike later. I'm asking Earth not to spend the truth on the cheapest possible purchase. That angered him because it was true enough to sound cruel. You think the chamber can be forced upward, he said. From local blame to structural blame. Yes. And if it can't, then Earth will lose under a false law in full public light. Which means the law will no longer be false in shadow. It will be false in record. Jonas gave a bitter short laugh. That is the kind of sentence people say before their careers end. Mine was over the moment I accepted this assignment. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw that she meant it. A soft tone signaled a secure relay. Jonas accepted it, frowned, then handed the slate over. Preliminary analysis from the archive contact. Lumesaren respond. Elara opened the message. Archivist Lum Saren served in the foundational records vault beneath the judicial tiers. Officially, she was a neutral functionary. Unofficially, she was one of the few living people who still understood how much of the Council's border doctrine had been assembled during the migration shocks. The message was brief. Unusual access signatures confirmed. Older than expected. Multiple doctrine revisions stabilized under continuity protection. Not random. Not recent. Meeting possible only off main archive channels. Elara read it twice. Jonas leaned in. Well, she found something. How much? Enough to scare her. He exhaled. That can mean anything. No, Elara said. With archivists, it usually means one thing. The damage predates the current people benefiting from it. That was bad. If the manipulation was recent, they could expose a conspiracy. If it was old, it was worse. Old lies fused into law. Old lies became the floor everyone stood on. A gong tone rolled through the chamber, calling parties back to examination. Elara looked toward the lower archive access routes and made her decision. First, she needed the chamber to keep speaking. Then she needed Loom to tell her exactly what old lie they were standing on. The second session began with witness examination and censor interpretation. Velon Kreth built his case carefully because he did not need to overstate. He placed fragments in sequence and let sequence create confidence. Coalition monitors saw pressure rising in the corridor. Earth tasking signals entered. Civilian navigation degraded. Fire followed. He avoided words like murder because murder invited hard proof. He used terms like intervention, destabilization, unauthorized force chain, and fatal command interpretation. Those were bureaucratic weapons. They killed slower and survived appeal. A Yedrin convoy navigator testified through a translation veil that traffic beacons had been flickering before the strike. A medical tender pilot, said she, heard coalition hails ordering freeze compliance, and then heard Earth channels demanding immediate movement. A coalition analyst presented synchronization charts that framed Earth's response window as aggressive rather than protective. Elara let each piece land. Then she rose for cross-examination. The room expected denial. They expected her to hammer each witness separately and build confusion out of contradiction. Instead, she asked clean, narrow questions. To the navigator, she asked when corridor markers began to drift. Before weapons fire, the witness answered. How long before? Unclear. Less than a standard minute. Had you seen that pattern before in normal congestion? No. To the medical pilot, Elara asked, did your board receive a unified command signature from all corridor authorities? No. There were overlapping channels. Meaning, we had conflicting movement orders. Then Elara turned to the coalition analyst. Are your synchronization charts based on live raw sensor chains or adjudicated public composites? The analyst paused. Composite chains validated for legal use. Not raw. Raw chains are not standard for public proceeding. Because they're noisier? Because they're unstable without contextual calibration, meaning they require trusted assumptions. The analyst stiffened. They require expert interpretation. Elara inclined her head. No further questions. Jonas looked almost offended from the rear position. She had not destroyed anyone. She had only planted one idea in the chamber. The map had started failing before the shooting. The command structure had already split. An illegal record standing over the event was built on interpreted composites, not raw reality. It was not enough. Not close. But it was movement. Veyne responded by requesting interim censure language against Earth for withholding evidence, while conducting what he called structural insinuation. Several delegates from the outer manufacturing bloc backed him. The humanitarian caucus held off. The neutral trade group fractured. By the third hour, Elara could feel the center of the room hardening against her. That was part of the cost. When the chamber broke from midday recess, she crossed 2 security corridors and descended through administrative levels where public noise could no longer reach. Jonas came with her, along with one Silent Earth security officer who remained outside the final lock. They were heading below the judicial tiers to the archive annex. Elara needed Loom to confirm whether the corridor map itself had been falsified long before Corridor 9. The archive annex smelled of cooled metal and paper sealant. It was one of the few places on Halcyon Ring where age did not feel ceremonial. It felt operational. Loom Saren met them in a narrow review room lined with dark storage crates and suspended data spines. She was slight, gray-eyed, and older than the active record staff above by what might have been 40 years. Her species showed age in the hands first. Hers were lined like cracked ceramic. "You should not be here," she said without greeting. "And yet you asked for the meeting," Elara replied. Loom's gaze moved to Jonas. He stays. Loom keyed a privacy lattice into place. "I reviewed legacy continuity protections tied to corridor doctrine. You were correct to suspect non-random revision. You were incorrect about its scale." Jonas spoke first. "How bad?" Loom looked at him, then at Elara. "The current legal architecture governing Corridor 9 does not descend cleanly from the public refugee stabilization accords." Elara felt her pulse slow further, which usually meant danger was confirming itself. "Say it plainly." Loom did. The foundational routing data was standardized after the Nerith displacement wave under emergency override. Multiple civilian passage models were collapsed into militarized risk lanes. Over time, those revisions became the basis for legal distinction between protected flow and contested flow. Jonas stared at her. "You're saying the law's map is wrong." "I'm saying the law's map was made wrong on purpose and later treated as inherited fact." The room seemed to narrow. Elara asked the next question carefully. "What?" "Loom is face hardened." "Because uncontrolled refugee traffic destabilized border investors, patrol contracts, and customs throughput. Because emergency committees were told stability mattered more than fidelity. Because once the revisions prevented several larger wars, no one wanted to reopen the means by which that stability had been bought." Jonas gave a small sound that was almost disbelief. "So every case built on those lanes." "Not every case," Loom said. "Enough of them." "Enough for what?" "Enough that no chamber will want this spoken aloud." Elara stepped closer to the table. "Who knows? Not many. Fewer now than in the beginning. Some records were continuity sealed. Others were normalized. Most people living under the doctrine likely believe it was always what it is. That was exactly the kind of lie that survived for generations. Not a secret people actively defended every morning. A structure too old and too useful to examine." Jonas looked between them. "In Corridor 9, Loom touched the table and brought up a layered model. Under public doctrine, Corridor 9 was a regulated freeze lane with armed contamination risk. Under the buried pre-standard models, it aligns with a civilian surge artery used during displacement events." She looked at Elara to make sure the point landed. "That matters because signals interpreted as unlawful civilian drift under the current doctrine would read as predictable escape compression under the original." Elara understood immediately. The convoy did not become disorderly inside a lawful military lane. It was crushed inside a civilian pressure route that the law later mislabeled. Loom nodded. "And any forced decision built on the current designation begins from a false premise." Jonas ran a hand over his face. "We can blow them apart with this." "No, Elara said. He turned toward her, stunned. This is what we came for. This is what we suspected. It is not what we use yet. Loom looked at her sharply. If you intend to reveal this, you should do so before the chamber consolidates the narrow accusation. Once they partition the proceeding, they can isolate local command conduct from doctrine. I know. Then why wait? Elara met the archivist's eyes. Because if I reveal this now as unverified archive history, they call it contamination. Political salvage. Human desperation. They will challenge chain integrity, witness neutrality, custodial authority, historical calibration, everything. She stepped closer to the table. I need them to certify the current framework first in open session under live record. I need them to claim the doctrine is sound before I show what it stands on. Loom held her gaze a moment longer, then understood. You want the chamber to bind itself. I want them to decide whether they stand on truth or convenience when they can still pretend those are the same thing. Loom breathed out slowly. That is cruel. It is less cruel than what they have been doing to the dead for decades. When they left the annex, the goal was clear. They had to get back into the chamber before the case was narrowed and force the court to stand behind its own map in public. On the walk back toward the chamber, Jonas finally spoke. They were back in the service corridors now, moving toward the public levels before recess ended. You already knew that was the shape. I knew the possibility, not the depth. You still won't use the full package. Not yet. He stopped near Service Junction. You are gambling Earths, standing on the assumption that old law can be forced into daylight. Elara turned back toward him. No, I'm gambling on something smaller. People become careless when they think they are protecting the obvious. Jonas shook his head. You always do that. Do what? Make it sound narrow. Make it sound manageable. We are not nudging a tired minister into overstatement. We are walking into the center of the council's self-image with a torch. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. We are. By the time the afternoon session resumed, public sentiment had worsened. Commentary feeds framed Elara as evasive. The outer protectorates were furious. The trade blocs wanted closure. Even some humanitarian observers were saying Earth's envoy had become more interested in theory than survival. That too was part of the cost. To hold back a defense in public, you had to accept being hated before you were understood. And there was never any guarantee the second part would happen. Sarek Vol reopened the chamber with visible impatience. The forum will now consider procedural narrowing of the case toward direct command liability and emergency force interpretation. There was the trap closing. If the chamber narrowed the case at this stage, the larger structure could be ruled irrelevant. Earth could win small or lose small, but the doctrine beneath the corridor would survive untouched. Velon stood. In light of the human envoy's refusal to disclose exculpatory material and her repeated attempts to enlarge the matter beyond operational accountability, the coalition requests immediate partition. Let this chamber determine first whether Earth acted outside lawful force thresholds at Corridor 9. Broader policy discussion, if any, may be deferred. Several delegates signaled approval at once. Sarek began to respond. Elara stood before he could finish. Earth objects. On what ground? Sarek asked. On the ground that the forum is about to pronounce on conduct without publicly affirming the legal terrain in which that conduct occurred. Sarek's tone sharpened. The legal terrain is established. Then say so. The room tensed. Phelan's eyes narrowed. Commander Veyne is again substituting spectacle for defense. No, Elara said. I'm asking the chamber to do what every minor world, every displaced convoy, and every patrol officer has been told to trust it does. Stand by its own framework in public language. Sarek folded his hands. The council does not certify settled law each time it is applied. You are not applying settled law to a customs fine, Elara replied. You are preparing to assign historic blame before the full transit lattice. A silence followed. She pressed before anyone could break it. If the current border framework governing Corridor 9 and adjacent refugee lanes is valid, intact, and derived from reliable foundational data, let the chamber say so plainly for the record before it uses that framework to judge any command action inside it. That was the move. Simple enough for the public. Dangerous enough for the officials. It forced the issue into one sentence. It could no longer hide behind abstractions. Elon tried to step around it. No lawful proceeding should permit a respondent to hold evidence hostage until ceremonial assurances are spoken. Elara turned toward him. And no lawful proceeding should fear stating the soundness of the law it relies on. For the first time that day, the upper galleries responded not with outrage, but with uncertainty. Sarek knew it too. If he refused a statement, it would look like caution at best and weakness at worst. If he gave it, it would seem like ordinary confidence. Institutions fell most easily into traps that resembled dignity. He conferred briefly with the associate officers. The chamber watched every movement. Then Sarek raised his head. For clarity and without prejudice to subsequent review, this forum affirms that the governing border framework relevant to Corridor 9 remains legally valid and publicly reliable for purposes of adjudication. Elara did not move. That is insufficient. A shock passed through the room. Sarek's voice went cold. You will not dictate the chamber's language. I will not, Elara said. But the sentence must include foundation. Velon almost smiled. She is buying time with syntax. Elara ignored him. If you wish to judge Earth under that doctrine, say the doctrine derives from reliable foundational data. The associate officers looked at Sarek again. One gave the smallest reluctant nod. He had already stepped too far toward public assurance to back away cleanly. Sarek spoke into the record. This forum affirms that the governing border framework relevant to Corridor 9 remains legally valid, publicly reliable, and derived from reliable foundational data for purposes of adjudication. There it was. The sentence entered the live record and flowed outward across every channel carrying the session. Jonas closed his eyes once, very briefly. Elara inclined her head. Earth acknowledges the statement. Then she sat down. The room did not know yet that it had just tightened a wire around its own throat. The next phase moved into technical examination. Velon, perhaps sensing momentum, pushed hard. He called for interim censure against Earth for delayed evidence disclosure. He repeated that humanitarian improvisation did not excuse unlawful force. He warned smaller powers against what he called selective moral exceptionalism. The room was beginning to follow him again. Elara led him. She used her next questioning block not to attack his witnesses directly, but to establish the layers of interpretation standing between reality and law. Composite feeds, custodial summaries, route designation matrices, calibration assumptions, translation lag in mixed convoy traffic. She never made it sound academic. She made it sound human. A pilot sees 3 lanes. A legal chart says there are 2. One voice says move. Another says freeze. A mother aboard a refugee carrier cannot tell which map the guns are using. That reached people better than doctrine ever would. But still was not enough. By the close of the second day, Earth was losing. Not in final vote count. Not yet. But in pressure. In patience. In the room's desire to be done. That night, after the chamber finally closed for the day, Elara stood alone in the mission observation corridor and looked out through the shielded glass at the transit arcs beyond Halcyon Ring. Ships crossed the dark like quiet embers. Somewhere along those routes were the survivors from Corridor 9, trying to build meaning out of alarms, smoke, and half-remembered orders. The door behind her opened. Jonas stepped in carrying 2 cups. He offered one, and she took it. They're calling you arrogant now, he said. They were calling me evasive this morning. I think they'll cycle through several more before the end. He leaned against the rail. The neutral trade bloc met with Coalition Council after session close. The Protectorate Caucus wants a limited ruling tomorrow. There's also pressure from the manufacturing tiers to keep doctrine review separate from liability review. Of course there is. He studied her. Do you ever doubt it? The case. The method. Elara looked out into the dark. Yes. He waited, perhaps surprised to hear the answer so quickly. Every hour, she said. Doubt is not the problem. The problem is timing. He drank from the cup, then asked the question he had been holding back. What if we could save Earth cleanly? And that's the most any envoy has a right to do. That was a real question. It deserved a real answer. Elaborate it, she said. He did. What if the chamber is exactly what it looks like? Cowardly, procedural, more concerned with stability than justice. What if forcing it to look deeper only teaches it to close ranks harder? What if the best service we can do for Earth is to preserve leverage for later and not burn everything now? She considered that. Then Earth keeps its seat, she said, and the next convoy dies on the same lie. Maybe not. It will. You can't know that. I know systems, Elara said. When false maps are rewarded for preventing larger conflict, they do not correct themselves. They spread. They become the responsible center. They turn every later death into tragic necessity. Jonas looked down at the floor. I hate when you sound certain. I'm not certain about outcome, she said. I'm certain about rot. He gave a tired breath that could almost have been a laugh. That is somehow less comforting. A long moment passed. Then he said, Loom sent another packet. She found continuity references to independent witness committees during the Nerith stabilization period. Not many names survived. One did. Elara turned toward him fully. Who? Former corridor adjudicator. Retired. Name is Runtal Oren. She knew the name faintly. An old legal officer from the migration era, known for refusing several pressure ratifications and then disappearing into minor archive service near the inner agricultural loops. Alive? She asked. Apparently. Reach him. Jonas frowned. He's under protected, quiet status. No official channel will patch us through in time. Then find the unofficial one. The next morning the chamber opened to a surprise motion from the upper judicial tier. A senior oversight officer named Mirian Sol petitioned for immediate narrowing with hard time limits on all remaining examination. That was the higher layer stepping in now. Not the coalition alone. The institutional instinct to contain itself had awakened. Mirian Sol's argument was elegant. She spoke of grief, public confidence, and the need to distinguish doctrine review from emotional opportunism. She spoke of the danger of allowing one respondent power to transform a casualty event into general constitutional destabilization. The words were smooth. The meaning was blunt. Stop this now. Elara listened, then asked for reply time. Sarek granted it reluctantly. She rose. Yesterday, this forum affirmed that the framework governing Corridor 9 remains legally valid, publicly reliable, and derived from reliable foundational data. Earth accepted that affirmation. Today we hear new calls to cut away questions bearing directly on foundation. The forum may do that, but if it does, it should also state in record that it prefers speed over certainty where those claims are concerned. Mirian Sol, answer at once. We prefer relevance. Elara turned toward her. Then let us be relevant. If the chamber wishes to judge forced choices inside Corridor 9, it must accept examination of the map, designation, and route doctrine defining what Corridor 9 was. Mirian's mouth tightened. That is already settled. Then you should welcome confirmation. Velan rose in support of Mirian. The human envoy repeats the same cycle. Imply hidden fault, refuse direct exculpation, then demand systemic review as the price of any conclusion. This is not law. It is leverage. Elara met his eyes. Yes, she said. It is leverage. That is what smaller powers must use when larger powers mistake habit for legitimacy. The chamber reacted to that more sharply than to anything else she had said, because it was not simply legal. It was political truth spoken in an official room. Sarek restored order, but the temperature had changed. The line had been crossed. No one could now pretend this was only about one convoy. During the recess that followed, Jonas returned from the communications bay with a face that told her enough before he spoke. They were in a quieter side corridor now, away from the public galleries and the main cameras. You found him. I did. Runtal Oren agreed to transmit if compelled by formal question from a sitting chamber. Elara absorbed that. He still respects the record. Apparently more than the people inside it. Good. Jonas hesitated. There's something else. Loom traced continuity indemnity compensation tied to the old revisions. The recipients were not just patrol contracts and custom syndicates. Several of the present coalition worlds inherited bond structures tied to corridor stability metrics. Elara understood immediately. The lie became collateral. Yes, that was why no one wanted doctrine review. Not because old officials feared embarrassment, because current systems were still built on the returns. A false map had become an asset class. That was uglier than she expected, and she had expected ugliness. By midday, Sarek Vol granted a final structured evidence block before procedural closure. Velon used it to drive home the human cost. He displayed hull fragments, distress calls, medical loss estimates, and rescue delay charts. He was careful not to indulge spectacle. He did not need to. The dead did enough work on their own. Then he looked at Elara and said, "If Earth has evidence clearing its operational chain, this is its final honorable moment to produce it." The chamber quieted around that sentence. It was skillful, public, moral, and completely false. Elara stood. Earth will produce evidence, but not the package this chamber expected. Thalen's eyes narrowed. Sarek leaned forward. "Proceed." Elara did not start with the archive package. She started with the chamber's own statement from the day before. It appeared above them in exact transcript form. This forum affirms that the governing border framework relevant to Corridor 9 remains legally valid, publicly reliable, and derived from reliable foundational data for purposes of adjudication. She let the room hear its own confidence. Then she continued, "Earth accepts the Chamber's desire for relevance, so we will be precise. The accusation before this forum depends on 3 linked claims. First, that Corridor 9 at the time of the event was lawfully designated under current border doctrine. Second, that civilian movement within that corridor had become unlawful drift under that designation. Third, that command decisions made by Earth within that doctrine should be judged as if the doctrine itself rests on reliable original data." She turned slightly. Earth now challenges the 3rd claim. That was the pivot, not exculpation. Foundation. Elon moved to interrupt. Sarek raised a hand for him to sit. Elara continued. Earth requests live witness transmission from retired adjudicator Ren Tao Oren, formerly attached to migration oversight during the Nerith stabilization revisions. Mirian's soul stood immediately. Objection. Historical witness relevance is speculative. Elara did not even look at her. The chamber affirmed foundation. The witness served at the moment of foundation. Relevance is direct. There was no clean way to deny that without weakening their own statement. Sarek knew it. He conferred. The room waited. Then, with visible displeasure, he authorized the transmission. Rin Tao Oren appeared as a pale projection above the witness circle, old, bent, and speaking from what looked like a quiet agricultural dome lit by artificial dawn. His voice was rough but stable. "I confirm identity," he said. Elara began with careful questions. Not broad, not dramatic. During the Nerith displacement wave, did emergency committees revise civilian traffic models for distress corridors? Yes. Were some revisions justified as temporary stabilizers rather than faithful route representation? Yes. Did those revisions later become part of standing border doctrine? Yes. Were all affected corridor authorities informed that the revised maps differed materially from original civilian surge models? No. A sound moved through the chamber. Elara pressed. Why not? Rin Tao Oren closed his eyes for a moment. Because the revised maps reduced cross-border panic and helped prevent several armed confrontations. Once that happened, senior bodies argued that reopening the underlying distortion would do more harm than preserving it. Was the distortion acknowledged internally? Yes. Was it intended to continue indefinitely? No. What changed? Stability became profitable. That sentence reached every tier. Not poetic, not loud, just impossible to absorb comfortably. Elon rose with immediate objection. The witness is providing interpretation. Ren Tao Oren turned his old face toward him. No, he said. I'm giving the shortest honest answer. The upper balconies erupted in layered sound before Sarek called them back down. Elara continued. Adjudicator Oren, did the corridor models relevant to later sectors, including the region now known as Corridor 9, inherit those stabilized distortions? Yes. Then under the original surge models, would civilian pressure patterns later classified as unlawful drift appear differently? Yes. How? They would appear as predictable civilian escape, compression, moving through older humanitarian arteries. Elara stepped away from the witness field and looked up at the chamber. There it is, she said. The law's map and the dead did not begin at the same place. Veyne pushed forward now, abandoning some of his earlier calm. Even if legacy doctrine review reveals distortion, Earth is still answerable for its own forced decisions inside existing law. Yes, Elara said. Inside existing law. She turned and finally signaled Jonas. For the first time in the proceeding, the sealed Earth package opened on the public screens. Raw timing chains appeared. Not polished composites. Not legal summaries. Raw tactical logs. Jonas patched in 3 synchronized tracks. Coalition monitor latency. Public adjudicated composite. Earth escort raw sequence. The gap was small, barely visible to untrained eyes. Elara explained it plainly. The record distributed across the transit lattice places Earth's first heavy emission before major civilian collapse. Raw synchronized chain places it after the corridor had already entered false designation conflict, and after coalition command overlays produced contradictory movement orders inside a misclassified civilian artery. She highlighted the next layer. These ghost transponder signatures were used to justify armed contamination risk. They did not originate from live hostile craft. They were reflected identifiers from dead cargo shells cycling through outdated route assumptions. Even the non-technical delegates could follow because she was not speaking like an engineer. She was speaking like someone explaining how people got trapped on the wrong instructions. The chamber was told Earth forced violence into a stable lane, she said. The raw chain shows a different reality. A civilian route mislabeled decades ago compressed under conflicting control. Coalition systems interpreted panic as unlawful movement because the doctrine beneath them had forgotten what that movement actually was. Veyne fought for the room. Earth still fired. Yes, Elara said. The answer hit harder than denial would have. Yes, Earth fired. At obstruction batteries, pinning the compression front closed. Earth violated current corridor law to open passage for civilians trapped inside a corridor current law had no moral right to define. For a second, nobody moved. She continued before the stillness broke. If Earth had submitted this package at opening stage, this chamber could have done what it wanted. It could have cleared or condemned one command chain and left the foundation untouched. That is why Earth refused. Not because we had nothing. Because this was never only about us. Now Veyne did lose his calm. You endangered procedural stability for political theater. Elara turned on him. No, Minister. Your system endangered living people for decades and called the result stability. That was the line that broke the room. Not into chaos. Into something more dangerous for those in power. Recognition. Not universal. Not clean. But enough. Enough that delegates who had come prepared to dispose of Earth now had to decide whether they would publicly defend the idea that a profitable lie became law and therefore remained respectable. Miriam's soul tried one last salvage path. The existence of historical distortion does not automatically void current governance. To collapse doctrine in response to one hearing would risk. Elara cut across her, not loudly, but with perfect timing. No one asked you to collapse doctrine because of one hearing. Reality already did that. We are only discussing whether the chamber will admit it happened. Saraval had gone still in the way powerful people did when they realized their available exits were all humiliating. He attempted the narrow route. The forum may distinguish between broad doctrinal concern and immediate event liability. Elara was ready for that. No, she said. Not anymore. She brought the transcript back overhead, the one he had spoken himself. This forum affirmed in public record that the framework relevant to Corridor 9 remains legally valid, publicly reliable, and derived from reliable foundational data for purposes of adjudication. Her voice remained controlled. You do not now get to use that framework against Earth while calling the question of origin separate. If you wish to convict Earth under that doctrine, you must also affirm you knew what kind of doctrine it was. If you wish to retract that confidence, then the chamber must admit that every judgment built on it is now under shadow. The associate judges looked at Sarek with something close to alarm, because they all understood the same thing at once. Earth had not merely revealed the lie. Earth had forced the council itself to speak the lie in confidence before the reveal. That was why Elara had withheld the package. She did not want to defeat an accusation. She wanted the institution to commit its own weight to the false floor first. Jonas, watching from the rear bench, felt the full scale of it settle at last. He had known the strategy. Only now did he understand its cruelty and its necessity. The upper galleries broke into competing reactions. Some demanded immediate doctrine suspension. Others shouted that Earth had engineered constitutional sabotage. One block of protectorate delegates walked out entirely. Several trade representatives began emergency side-channel consultation. The public feeds exploded beyond anything Halcyon Ring's moderation filters could control. Sarah called for silence 3 times. On the 4th, the chamber obeyed. What followed was not clean victory. Rooms like this never gave clean victory when wounded. Sarek announced emergency sealed consultation among the judicial officers. Thelon demanded interim censure against Earth for unlawful force regardless of doctrine questions. Miri and Sol pushed for doctrinal quarantine without liability implication. The Humanitarian Caucus insisted the chamber could not proceed as if nothing had changed. 2 neutral blocs requested record preservation orders over all legacy corridor archives. The session suspended for 3 hours. During that interval, Halcyon Ring changed. The story left the chamber and turned into a crisis across the station. Delegates who had ignored old corridor law for years now demanded original map access. Markets tied to border stability dipped. Commentary streams filled with survivors from older transit events asking whether their own dead had been misnamed too. Inter-system governments issued statements urging calm. Outer systems issued statements blaming Earth for destabilization. Several minor worlds did something more important. They asked for copies of the record. Elara sat alone in the Earth consultation room, while Jonas managed channels outside. The room was small, quiet, and unadorned. Only one screen remained active, holding the transcript line that mattered most. Sarek's statement of confidence. The chamber's public guarantee of sound foundation. Jonas entered after some time and shut the door behind him. The station's in shock, he said. Coalition markets are falling. 3 mid-lane governments just requested doctrine review under emergency humanitarian authority. Elated? No. Good. He sat across from her. I think I hate being right next to history. That will pass. No, I truly hate it. A pause. Then he asked, what happens if they try to bury all this through a procedural compromise? Suspend Earth's case, open a quiet review, release a statement about complex historical concerns, then suffocate it under committee language for 10 years. They might. And then they do it after the chamber heard the truth in public. After they spoke their own certainty in public. After dozens of governments requested the record. That matters. He looked at her. You really believe record changes worlds? No, she said. People change worlds. Record changes what they can deny while doing it. The final session resumed in evening light. Though Halcyon Ring had no sunset of its own, the chamber lights had shifted warmer to signal extended proceedings. It made everything look older and less certain. Sarek Vol returned to the center chair, carrying no visible notes. That was a sign. He intended to speak not as a technician of procedure, but as the face of institutional survival. This forum, he began, has reviewed the extraordinary claims and historical materials entered during today's session. The forum acknowledges serious concern regarding legacy corridor stabilization practices and their relation to present doctrine. It was careful language. Too careful. Elara listened without moving. Sarek continued. However, concern regarding legacy practice does not automatically settle the matter of immediate command responsibility at Corridor 9. The Forum therefore considers temporary partition. There it was. The salvage attempt. Elara was already on her feet before he finished. And the Forum intends to do exactly what Earth warned it would do. Sarek's gaze hardened. You will sit. No. The room froze. That one word did more than signal defiance. It told every listener the old script was broken. Elara stepped into the speaker field before security could even decide whether protocol allowed intervention during judicial address. Do not call this partition, she said. Call it what it is. A proposal to preserve the authority of a false map by isolating the deaths it helped create. Elon rose in fury. Commander Veyne, you presume too much. I presume exactly what your coalition asked for at opening stage. Narrow blame. Fast conclusion. Protected doctrine. She turned back towards Sarek. If the Forum wishes to rule on Earth's force chain, it may do so. But not under the protection of a sentence it can no longer honestly speak. Your own record is against you. The framework cannot be both reliably grounded and materially distorted in ways that changed civilian classification. Choose. It was no longer legal argument alone. It was moral compression. The same kind of compression that had broken the convoy at Corridor 9. A room closing in on itself, because every exit now demanded sacrifice. Sarek looked up at the galleries, at the delegates, and at the officers beside him. He understood the real question now. Not whether Earth could be blamed. Whether the Council could survive being seen choosing convenience over truth in a case this public. That was the choice Elara had built for him. The associate officer on his left leaned in and said something too low for the public feed. Sarek answered without looking at her. The officer on his right then spoke. Mirian's soul went still. Elon, for the first time in the entire proceeding, seemed unsure where the floor beneath him was. When Sarek finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Not softened. Heavier. The Forum declines immediate liability ruling. A wave ran through the chamber. He raised a hand for silence. The existing adjudicative basis has been materially challenged by evidence and testimony bearing on corridor foundation, civilian designation integrity, and continuity of doctrine. Accordingly, the Forum orders the following. He read each point separately. First, the pending liability determination against Earth is suspended without prejudicial conviction. Elon closed his eyes once. Second, all enforcement actions deriving from the current doctrinal designation of Corridor 9 and directly linked adjacent sectors are frozen under emergency humanitarian review. Now the upper tiers were no longer simply reacting. They were changing sides in real time. Third, a fully independent doctrine audit shall be convened under cross-system custodial authority, with archive preservation orders extending to all continuity-sealed records bearing on Nerith-era stabilization revisions and subsequent corridor inheritance. Mirian's soul looked as if she had swallowed something sharp. Fourth, the Chamber acknowledges that no final judgment on Earth's operational conduct can be rendered with integrity until the doctrine relevant to civilian status and force interpretation is re-examined in full. That was as close to institutional confession as men like Sarek Vol could survive uttering. It was not a clean exoneration. It was more important than one. Elon forced himself up. This outcome rewards destabilization. Sarek did not look at him. This outcome responds to the record. That line would travel far. The chamber dissolved into layered motion again, but this time the direction was different. Not toward Earth as a defendant, toward the structure itself. Some delegates were furious with humanity. That would remain true for years. Some were grateful. Most were afraid. The old certainty had broken, and once broken, certainty did not go back into its container. Elara remained standing until the formal seal closed the session. Only then did she sit. Jonas crossed the floor toward her, moving through officials, aides, and security staff who no longer knew whether to treat Earth's table as isolated or central. Well, he said when he reached her, we are not convicted. No, we are not cleared. No, we may have started a system-wide doctrine crisis. Yes, He let out a breath that turned into a tired laugh. I'm going to need a less dramatic profession. You won't take one. That is true. For the first time in 2 days, a tiny amount of warmth touched her mouth. Across the chamber, Velon Kreth stood with Coalition Council around him. He saw her looking and met her gaze. There was no theatrical hatred there. Something more durable. Recognition. He understood she had not simply beaten him. She had made his entire philosophy harder to hide behind decent language. That kind of defeat lasted. Later, when the public tears had emptied and the maintenance lights had begun their lower cycle, Elara stepped out of the chamber alone. The corridors of Halcyon Ring were quieter now, but not calm. Screens still carried fragments of the hearing. Staff moved faster than usual. Messages were being drafted in 100 ministries. Old archives were being copied. Financial systems were repricing assumptions they had never expected to revisit. Somewhere beyond the diplomatic wing, survivor families were hearing that their dead might have perished inside a lie far older than the day itself. Outside the main judicial arch, Loom Saren waited near a column of dark metal. You made them say it, the archivist said. They said it themselves. Loom gave her a dry look. Archivists dislike rhetorical distinctions. Elara stopped beside her. You preserve enough for the truth to survive. I preserve enough for no one to say later that nothing was known. That too. Loom looked down the corridor where officials were still moving in tight groups. They will try to narrow the audit. They will call for stability. They will warn of unrest. They will say ordinary people need order more than old accuracy. Yes, and they will not be entirely wrong. Elara considered that. No, she said. They won't. That was the painful part. The lie had not survived because all its defenders were monsters. It survived because it had prevented some wars, stabilized some routes, and made trade less fragile. It had done real good through false means. That was why it lasted. That was why exposing it would cost so much. Loom studied her face. You knew the suspension would be the best possible outcome, didn't you? It was one of two. What was the other? A guilty verdict under full record. Loom absorbed that and understood. You would have taken it. Yes. Why? Because then the council would have condemned Earth on a false foundation, in open view. Either way, the record would split. Loom was quiet for a moment. That is a very hard thing to ask. Of your own world. Elara looked back toward the chamber doors. Earth sent me because some things should cost someone. An hour later, after the chamber had gone quiet, Jonas found her at the station's outer observation band, where Halcyon Ring's curve gave way to a deep view of the trade lanes beyond. Freighters moved like slow sparks. A medical convoy rotated through escort vectors near the eastern arc farther out. Migration traffic entered dark. He leaned beside her at the glass. 3 direct statements from Earth just came through. The Council cannot easily freeze distribution now. Earth accepted the suspension, welcomed the independent audit, recognized the dead at Corridor 9, and refused retaliatory language. Good. The outer feeds are calling that statesmanlike. It is strategic. That too. He handed her a fresh slate. There's one more thing. She read. Several minor worlds from the transit margin had jointly requested observer status on the doctrine audit. One line from the request stood out. We have buried too many people inside maps, we were told, not a question. Elara held the slate for a while without speaking. Jonas looked out into the dark. Do you think this changes how the galaxy sees humanity? No, she said at last. Not all at once. How then? They will still call us volatile, impatient, difficult, morally inconvenient. A pause. But some of them will stop calling us weak. He nodded. And some will hate us for this. Yes. That worries me less than it used to. That means you are learning. He laughed softly. I preferred it when learning meant books. They stood there in silence for a time. The station turned beneath them. The star beyond remained small and white. Traffic kept moving because it always did, even when institutions cracked. At last Jonas asked the question that mattered most now that the hearing was over. What happens next? Elara looked out at the long dark routes between worlds. The same thing that always happens after a lie loses the protection of certainty. People rush to save what they can. Some save truth. Some save power. Most save habit. And all of them call it responsibility. That sounds exhausting. It will be. He shifted against the rail. And Earth. Earth will be punished in ways no verdict could have accomplished. Informally. Quietly. Access delays. Inspection burdens. Diplomatic frost. Funding resistance. Narrative retaliation. Jonas grimaced. You make that sound like weather. It is weather. He was silent, then spoke more softly. Was it worth it? Elara did not answer immediately. She thought of the chamber silence after Rentau. Oren said stability became profitable. She thought of Sarek Vol being forced away from clean condemnation. She thought of the survivors from Corridor 9 and of older convoys buried under older language. She thought of Earth officers who had broken current law to open passage inside a corridor current law had no moral right to define. Yes, she said, but not because we won. Jonas waited. Because the next person trapped inside that system may now know the system can be named. That was the real prize. Not acquittal. Not applause. Vocabulary. Once people had words for a structure, they were no longer forced to suffer it as weather. A message tone sounded from her wrist terminal. Secure. Earth diplomatic channel. She opened it. Only one line from the foreign assembly chair. Sent without ornament. You are not sent there to be liked. Elara let out a breath that was the closest thing to laughter she had managed all week. Jonas read over her shoulder. That is either support or the coldest compliment in intergovernmental history. Both, she said. The station lights shifted again into late cycle blue. Below them, a convoy change heading under revised traffic advisories. Small movements first. That was how systems turned. Not all at once. In reluctant adjustments. In rewritten guidance. In extra checks that quietly admitted old certainty was gone. Far beyond the glass, one of the major transit lanes shimmered as heavy carriers entered fold alignment and vanished from visible space. Jonas watched the empty dark they left behind. When this gets taught later, what do you think they will say? Elara answered without looking away. They will say Earth stood trial at Halcyon Ring. And they will say the chamber expected a defense. He smiled faintly. And instead, she looked at the reflection of the station lights on the glass, then at the traffic beyond them. Instead, she said, Earth asked what kind of law had earned the right to judge anyone. That was not the end of the matter. Not close. The audit would become a battlefield of its own. Coalition assets would harden. Quiet pressure would spread through shipping, finance, and diplomacy. Friendly governments would urge restraint, which often meant surrender by another name. Old cases would reopen. Old graves would acquire new arguments around them. Some people would blame Earth for the instability that followed, because many people preferred a useful lie to an expensive truth. All of that would come. So would resistance. So would retaliation. So would the long cost. But so would something else. Memory. Doubt. And the slow fracture running through a system that had mistaken control for legitimacy. The Galactic Council had tried to place humanity inside a narrow frame and call that order. It had expected a frightened world eager to survive one hearing. It had expected a single accusation, a single defense, a single verdict, and then a clean return to the machinery that kept trade moving and consciences quiet. It did not get that. Earth had not come to Halcyon Ring to beg for innocence. It had come with a harder demand. If humanity was going to be judged, then the system doing the judging would first have to stand still long enough to let everyone see what it was made of. And when the chamber finally did stand still, the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of recognition. Out across the dark between worlds, that mattered more than any verdict they had failed to deliver. Earth did not leave Halcyon Ring with applause. It left with something heavier than victory, and far more dangerous to those who had judged it. A truth that could no longer be hidden behind procedure, profit, or polite language. Commander Elara Veyne had not come to that chamber to beg for mercy. She had come to force the galaxy to look at the law it had trusted, the system it had protected, and the cost it had buried for decades. The Council had expected a frightened world, desperate to survive one hearing. Instead, it faced a civilization willing to stand under accusation rather than let a lie keep calling itself order. That was the moment the room changed. Not because humanity shouted louder. Not because Earth proved itself stronger. But because for one long and terrible second, the entire chamber understood that the system judging Earth had been standing on broken ground all along. The verdict was delayed. The reckoning was not. They had tried to put Earth on trial. Instead, Earth put the whole system on record. If this story stayed with you, let that be heard. Like this video, so more people can find stories where humanity is tested, underestimated, and still refuses to break. Share it with someone who believes science fiction is not just about the stars, but about the truth we carry into them. And subscribe to the channel for more journeys through the Galaxy Council, the fate of Earth, and the moments when humanity stands alone and changes everything. Because out here, the final judgment is never as simple as power wants it to be.